Thanks, Tracy, for the introduction. And as Tracy mentioned, my name is Kevin Sandall, and I've had the privilege of serving as Covalience's CEO for the past 12 years. I've spent much of that time living in India and Malaysia and working alongside our team, which is located in northern India. Prior to that, I spent most of my career in consulting and corporate management in the technology arena, and I've spent over half my life living and working outside the US. Today, I'd like to share a little bit from my experience of outsourcing and working across much of the world in technology, and share some of the challenges that we most commonly see in outsourcing engagements, and what we hope are some practical ways to overcome them that will be helpful and useful to you, whether you're in the middle of an outsourcing engagement now or thinking about one for the future. I've also, as Tracy mentioned, we'll have a couple of guests at the end to share their real world experiences with you. And when we wrap up the call today, we'll be sending out also some follow-up information, hopefully some resources that might be helpful to you as you continue to explore outsourcing and how to make it as effective as possible for you and your business. Looking at the poll that everybody filled out coming in, it looks like a good number of you are not outsourcing currently, but thinking about doing so in the future. A few of you have some experience already or are currently outsourcing. Most of you seem to have had fairly decent experience with the outsourcing you're doing, but hopefully what we talk about today will give you some tools and some ideas to take it even to the next level. Just to get started, as we talk about outsourcing, when it started, a couple decades ago to become a trend, really the promise of outsourcing was lower cost, right? It was getting a lower cost compared to hiring or contracting locally. But today, in today's world, with things being as globalized as they've become, outsourcing becoming a fairly commonplace practice, what we find is that outsourcing's value has a lot more elements to it. It's access to talent, it's flexibility in how you engage for projects, it's the ability to scale quickly or to take on more work or to scale down even when you don't have as much work. It's about speed to market, being able to get more people working across time zones to speed up and accelerate the work that you're doing. And it's about capacity. It's about having the capacity to get your projects done. But what we found is that whether you're new to outsourcing or you've been outsourcing for a long time, there's a lot of challenges that can come up along the way. The 5 that we're going to talk about today are time zones, attrition, communication, productivity, and quality. And I'm going to dive into each one of these a little bit in turn as we go through the course of this presentation. So we'll start with time zones. When we look at time zones, the biggest issue with time zones is the ability to get people on your various project teams and your outsourcing team to overlap in a way that is productive for in-person collaboration. Teams often rely heavily on that, especially when they're getting started with outsourcing. There's a desire to have more on in-person collaboration. And so some of the things that we recommend as we've worked with this is if you're not already using an agile project methodology, to look at moving to a more agile methodology and then to fully integrate your teams. So look at your outsourcer as just a piece of that entire team and work as a cohesive team across both the outsourcer, the outsourced resources and the existing in-house resources. We'd like to incorporate check-in meetings. If you don't have time for a lot of overlap, but you can still get a 10, 15, 20-minute check-in every day, it helps to keep everybody connected. Sometimes we have them at the beginning and the end of the day at handoff points, but incorporating a check-in meeting is a really good way to just get some of that collaboration going and to make sure that there's communication about what's happening. A lot of teams are able to build reasonable overlap windows, typically 2 to 3 hours a day, or sometimes we recommend setting up a larger block, but only doing it once or twice a week so that you can still get those overlap times, but then break off and work independently in the time zones that the people on your teams are in. Another thing that you can do as you start to get that trust and communication working within the project is to actually leverage time zones for continuous development. And so we've had engagements we've seen where we get the team in one part of the world in the USA working on development. They hand it off in the evening to a team in the Asia somewhere, and they do QA on that. They do testing, and then they hand it back the next morning, and you can continue to go. And it's possible to start collapsing project timelines to a degree by doing that. And then we also recommend using asynchronous collaboration tools that allow you to track things in writing together in a database where you can share the information you need across those tools, and keep your meeting time to focus agendas and to spending time and things that require that back and forth, that more dynamic flow of a conversation. The second challenge that we encounter quite a bit, especially these days in today's market, is high attrition. A recent study done by LinkedIn just a year and a half or so ago showed that the technology sector, software sector globally had the highest attrition rate of any industry in the world at 13.2% per year. People switching jobs, changing from one team to another, or changing from one company to another. That can be even higher in places like India, some of the other Asian countries that outsource, African countries, Latin American countries where outsourcing is happening, because there's a large number or a high amount of demand and lots of places to jump. And so there tends to be quite a bit of attrition. And so there's a common, when you talk to people that are doing outsourcing, they're often frustrated because they started the project with one person, and 3, 4, 6 months later, they've had 3 or 4 different people filling that same role on the project. And obviously that creates all kinds of challenges with time lost in training, recruiting, ramping up, transferring knowledge, keeping the project's momentum, and trying to keep consistency in your deliverables, in your code and your software. So how do you deal with that attrition? So one of the things that that we recommend and that we suggest is that you find a partner, outsourcing partner, who first of all acknowledges that turnover is out there and that it's a risk. A lot of times people will want to kind of brush that under the carpet or not talk about it because it's hard to talk about the fact that people might be churning on their teams. Also look for companies that have a proven turnover rate that is acceptable. And look for the indicators of a company that's going to be able to retain the people on their team. We also recommend looking for teams that provide redundancy in the way they set up the engagement. So we often will engage in a way that we have, instead of having a one-to-one, one person to one full-time role type of a mapping, we'll actually have 2 half-time people working against one FTE, because it allows us to spread the knowledge across the project and across people in case there is something that happens that causes someone to leave, or the other side of that is that when we need to ramp up additional resources, maybe we need to surge on something, there's more people who are familiar with the project. So having that redundancy built in is important, and having a partner that can help, that has accountability in the cost of replacing those resources if they do leave. Making sure that you have a seamless transition when someone has to depart the project, and you don't lose productivity or lose time on that project while they're ramping up to jump into the project. Some other things that you can look for when you're looking for dealing with that attrition is look for online reviews of the employer. When we hire engineers in India, the first thing that they tell us in the interview is that they looked us up online to see what kind of a company we were. So there's lots of information out there, employees talking about their companies, the companies that they work for or worked for. So it's easy to find that kind of information. Look for an outsourcer that has a good work culture, one that maybe is in line with your company's work culture, but also that treats their employees well. One of the things that's happened as outsourcing has become more and more prevalent, and as factors like cost have become important and put pressure on the industry, is that the outsourcing industry has often taken on a look that looks more like a software factory, where you've got lots of people on these big teams that each has a small job that they execute over and over again, but they don't have a good picture of the big picture. They don't understand your business. They don't understand how their piece fits in with the other pieces that are being worked on. We find that if you can find an outsourcer that is more of a partner, that is engaged with you to make your business work and understand how your business works, what your market is, who your customers are, that understands and sees the bigger picture of what you're trying to accomplish, you're going to get better results. So you want to find a partner that is going to act as a partner and a consultant and engage with you as part of the team, as opposed to one that's going to try to push you into a factory process that can just be executed over and over again, but doesn't create a huge amount of value other than execution of those standardized processes. The third challenge that we encounter is communication. And whether you're outsourcing or you're working with your team, with just an internal team, communication is at the core of what makes teams work well or doesn't. And when you add in the challenges of remote work, of cross-cultural communication, it just makes it that much more important that you have good communication in place. Bad communication leads to frustration. It leads to confusion across your teams. It leads to lack of clarity. Often miscommunications happen that cause projects to get derailed or cause issues that can slow down a project or create significant cost or delay. And mistakes can happen. And what results from that is significant time lost and money lost. But most importantly, it's a miserable working experience, co-working experience for everybody involved. Your team and employees and the outsourcer alike. I'm going to talk about 3 aspects of communication today. There's lots of different ways we can look at communication, and we could dive into this in much more detail. In fact, we're looking at doing another webinar in the future to dive even deeper into these topics, but want to give just kind of an overview here. The obvious first thing people talk about when they talk about communication is just language. It's understanding each other. And there's a lot of challenges to understanding each other when you're working across multiple geographies, multiple cultures, accents, vocabulary, even the way we use language is different. You know, talking to someone who's from the UK versus someone in the US, we use language different. When you go beyond that to India or Australia or Singapore, you get a whole different, sometimes ways of using the English language to communicate. And then the speed of conversation, how fast people talk, how fast they're able to take in what you're saying and process it. And then when you start working remotely, you start getting all kinds of additional ambient issues that come into understanding language, whether it's the quality of the call or the video or interference or noise in the background, things like that that can make it harder. So what we suggest as you're looking at these types of challenges is, first of all, look for an outsourcing partner who brings people with good English proficiency, and not just the written form, because a lot of outsourcers will lean on just being able to write communication, and they want everything to be written. But you want an outsourcer that brings people that can listen and can speak as well, because when you do have those collaborative times, you want to make sure that they're productive. Make sure that they're investing in training and mentoring their team in communication and understanding how to communicate. And then you want to make sure that you use as much as possible video enhanced communication. This is true whether you've got a first language speaker or English as their second or third language. Video just creates a whole, brings in a whole rich wealth of information in our communication that we don't have when we're just talking on the phone. But most importantly, it helps to build trust, because I can see that the other person is paying attention. I can see that they're engaged. I can see that they're trying to express something that maybe they can't express as easily in words, but it comes out in their body language. So video communication is a critical part, and you want to be using that with your team and with your outsourcing team as much as you can to improve the quality of communication across your projects. The next one is context. And the way I describe this typically when I talk about it is the exposure you have to both the cultural and the business context of the people that you're working with. And I illustrate this sometimes with the idea of a automated car wash. So if you're in the US, you know, taking your car to a car wash and running it through an automated car wash is a fairly typical thing that you see and do in most communities in America. So if I was going to be building a point of sale system for an automated car wash, if I'm in the US, it's a very easy concept to get my head around. But when I work in a place like Africa or India, and I have a developer who's working on that project for me, they're likely to have never seen an automated car wash except maybe in a movie once or twice, but they've never experienced it. They don't know how it works. They don't know what that context is like. And so there needs to be a process of helping to create that context and make it possible for effective communication to happen. So what we recommend is making sure that your outsourcing partner has a way of creating that exposure for their team. We have a term we use at Covalience, we call it reverse offshoring. And for us, what that means is we've taken key management leadership people from our team in the US, and we've put them overseas in our different development locations, working side by side with our team members to provide mentoring and coaching and opportunities to share context, but also to resolve issues when they arise at directly at the level of where the engagement's happening. We also recommend looking for an outsourcer that is providing practical training in how to understand other cultures, how to learn and to absorb context, both from a business perspective, a business context, and a cultural context. And lastly, we recommend finding a team that sees the importance of this to the extent that they're spending time in relationship building conversations outside of your projects. We worked with, we've been working with a client now for 12 years where in the early days of the engagement, of working together, we would once a month have a meeting where they would bring in breakfast, donuts, bagels, and we would bring in dinner, you know, Indian food, and sit down at our conference table, and we'd have a call. And the only rule for the meeting was we don't talk about the project. We spend that time talking about holidays, customs, each other, families, to build those relationships that are really hard to build, that normally we would build at the water cooler or in the lunchroom, but it's much more difficult to build when you're thousands of miles apart. And so you have to intentionally build times for that, to build that relationship. And that's critical, particularly when you're working with Asian cultures, when you're working to some lesser extent with Latin American or African cultures. Relationship is a critical component of building trust. So some additional things that you can do is you can visit the site, go on site with your outsourcing partner, or have them come on site to your location when that's possible. That helps to build context. Spend time presenting the big picture to your team. Help them understand the bigger context of what you're doing and why you're doing it. Oftentimes we get caught up in task-oriented management and task-oriented conversations. We miss giving the big picture, helping our team be a part of the broader, bigger idea of what we're trying to accomplish. And then the last thing I would encourage is be curious and be accepting of curiosity. Ask questions. Why do you do it that way? How come you look at it from this perspective? What is how does this work in your part of the world? And be open to your outsourcing team asking the same types of questions of you, and be willing to give them those answers, because that's going to help build context. The third one that is cultural understanding. And again, there's a lot we could unpack here, but I just want to give a couple quick examples to show how this works, or how this affects outsourcing. And then, this is something that there's a lot of work out there that you can look at and dig into deeper. We're going to try to talk about this in a future webinar in more detail. But cultural understanding has to do with how we have different ways of norms of doing things, different ways of communicating and working together. So just some real basic examples. Back many years ago, a gentleman with the last name of Hofstede did a study for IBM. And he was looking at cultural indicators between India and the US, and looking at how they impact the work that's being done in outsourcing. And what he found was that there was three critical cultural indicators that the US and Indian cultures were on diametrically opposed sides of the continuum of the spectrum for those. And that has a significant impact, because if you can't find a way to meet in the middle between those, you end up having a lot of miscommunication, hurt feelings, and just difficulty in engaging with each other. So those those three, the first one was hierarchy, the idea of hierarchy. In the US, we have very flat organizations. It's very easy to communicate up and down in a hierarchy. Whereas in India and many other parts of the world, hierarchy is of significant importance in the way things work. If you've had any experience working with a culture with a lot of hierarchy in it, you'll often be in a project and only the person who's the manager or the top person on the team will do any of the talking. They'll have their conversations offline, but when it comes to connecting with you, you're only going to see the top person talking. In in a culture where we're used to flat organizations, we want to see everybody contributing. And while that offshore team is everybody's contributing, you're not going to see that as the client or as the partner working with them. And so understanding that that's happening is important. And how to work through that hierarchical structure or lack of hierarchy is important. Individualism versus collectivism. In the US, we tend to be very individualistic and self-reliant in our work and what we do, whereas many other cultures, India included, collectivism is a much stronger cultural value. And so projects get done working in collaboration in more of a collective way. And there's pros and cons to both, but understanding where each of them will bring strength to the project is important so that you can capitalize on that as you work through your engagement. And then the third one there is direct versus indirect communication. Western cultures, European, American, tend to be much more direct. We say what we mean. We're very to the point. In Eastern cultures and other parts of the world, indirect communication is far more prevalent, where a lot of what is being communicated is between the lines. If you've ever had a conversation where the person just wouldn't say no, or I can't, or I won't, they're telling you, but they're telling you indirectly. And if you don't know how to pick up those cues, it can lead to a lot of frustration. Likewise, they can get very offended when you say something very directly because they think you're angry with them or you're mad at them, when that may not in fact be the case. So what's important is that all of this is geared towards building trust. And the way that people build trust in different cultures is different. In Western cultures, we tend to build trust based on the execution of a task. Whereas in other Eastern cultures, other parts of the world, trust is built based on relationship, getting to know each other, understanding who each other are. So it's important to be aware of these and then to work towards meeting in the middle, as opposed to trying to have your outsourcer make the entire transition to your culture, or you having to make the entire transition to theirs. I'm going to look at productivity next. And one of the things that we find with productivity is we talk to different companies is there's this perception many times that it takes 2, 3, 4 outsourced developers to achieve the same result or the same outcomes that you can get from one person in-house. And I think part of that comes from a perspective of trying to find the lowest possible cost. And when we try to find the lowest possible cost in an outsourcing relationship, what that comes with very often is less experienced developers, poor quality code, more difficult communication, inefficient processes, a lack of transparency, and a lot of rework. And so what we recommend and what I typically will talk to people about is setting a better expectation for your outsourcing. Typically, what I see is that you should be able to get a 30 to 50% cost savings on equivalent outcomes with a good outsourcer, someone who's going to not just get the work done, but is going to start to add value beyond just accomplishing the tasks. To get there, to improve that productivity, the important part of it is to have a long-term mindset. To look at this as a long-term strategy, that you're going to build that relationship over time. You're going to invest in it to make it work. They're going to invest in it to make it work. And that's going to allow you to get to the level where you start to see better productivity or increased productivity. Implementing efficient processes, having continuous improvement processes within that, so that you're constantly reviewing and updating those processes is important. It's important to invest in building trust and creating transparency and clarity between the two teams. So a lot of reporting, having clear visibility into what's going on is important. Finding a partner that's willing to do that with you is important. And then it's also important to keep in mind that we're all going to make mistakes from time to time. Outsourced developers are no different than the developers you have in-house in that regard. From time to time, they're going to miss something. And so using those opportunities to coach through those those mistakes, those failures, and then also remembering that it's really important to celebrate the successes. Your outsourcing team wants to feel motivated. They want that empathy. They want to know that they're appreciated for the work they're doing, just as any employee on your team in-house would want to. And that will greatly, significantly contribute to them being more productive and being more involved and engaged in what you're doing. The most important thing with productivity is that if you invest in the relationships the same way you do with your local team members, you're going to see a far better result over time. The last area I want to look at is quality. And I like this quote this is a 19th century art critic, but I think this quote is valid today as much as it was then, and that there's hardly anything in the world that someone cannot make a little worse and sell a little cheaper. And the people who consider price alone are that person's lawful prey. Quality is often that thing that gets forgotten until it becomes the most important thing that you're concerned about because you got bad code coming out or not. And so thinking about quality up front with your outsourcers, your outsourcing engagement is important. You want to make sure that you don't have lack of testing. You know, the poor quality is going to come from not having enough testing, not having proper testing processes. In my experience, the first thing that gets cut in projects is the testing when the budget is getting tight or the timeline's getting tight because we want to get code out the door. Poor quality can also come from bad processes or poorly executed processes. So inefficient and ineffective processes are going to lead to poor quality overall. So it's the experience or the service as much as it is the deliverables that matter when you're evaluating quality. And then that when that focus is on cost, it can also lead to things like to corners getting cut and to an inattention to the details. So how do you avoid that? Well, one of the things that we recommend is making sure that your outsourcing partner has a built-in QA process to what they're doing and that you invest in having that QA component and not just the code development piece so that it's integrated together with what you're doing. Talk to your outsourcing partners, other customers. Find out specifically if they're happy with the quality that they're getting on the work that's being done and where their frustration points might be with that before you engage with a partner. Make sure your partner's got formal documented processes. A lot of outsourcing outfits are really just glorified body shops. They're hiring people and putting them on jobs as fast as they can and just turning the crank, but they don't have a lot of well-built process and they haven't really thought about how to engage with you and your process. And so that's something you can look for as an indicator of quality up front. And then you want to make sure that they're responsive, not just to the deliverable quality, but also to the process quality, that they're going to work with you to continuously improve. Some additional things that I recommend when I talk to our clients is that you want to make sure you raise issues clearly and you want to make sure that you raise them early. The earlier you raise the issue, the easier it is to get things back on track and the less it costs to fix the problem. You want to track and measure those issues visibly so everybody on your team and on your outsourcing team sees them and knows how to respond and is working towards keeping them working towards keeping good quality on the project. And then the most important thing in my mind is identifying when an issue that arises from quality perspective is due to communication issues and not just lack of technical expertise or understanding, but truly a misunderstanding or a communication issue. And when that happens, make sure that you build clear understanding early. And then the last thing is that you want to make sure that whenever you do have an issue, you focus time and effort on restoring trust back into the team. Again, a good outsourcing partner and a good outsourcing engagement is going to come from a relationship, not a transaction. And in order to build a good relationship, there has to be transparency, there has to be good communication, there has to be an investment of time, and there has to be mutual trust and respect between the whole team or across the whole team, both the outsourcers and the in-house members of that team. We often share our experience with this and with lots of different outsourcing engagements that we've set up. We typically see the same thing over and over again. as you enter into that engagement, there's some level of productivity that you've had kind of ongoing. And when you've engaged with that outsourcing, you're looking to reduce costs to get a higher level of value per dollar, if you will, or output per dollar. And so that's why you're bringing in an outsourcer. You're looking to expand that capacity, maybe get those dollars to stretch a little further in your development, but also bring in skills that you need, et cetera. And so as you're doing that, there's that baseline. And what typically happens in engagements that we work in is in that first 3 to 6 months, you have that ramp up and you get the team on board and they start knocking out those first few tickets. They're getting the low hanging fruits getting done. And you're like, this is working. I'm getting more things done. It's getting through. But typically within that first 3 to 6 months, an outsourcing engagement will hit what we often refer to as the valley of death. And that's where you hit that first challenge, one of these 5 challenges, or maybe some of the other challenges that are out there. You start to have communication concerns. You start to have misunderstandings. And this period, I've seen it last anywhere from 3 to 12 months or even longer, as particularly if these challenges aren't being addressed or these issues aren't being addressed. And oftentimes, this is where outsourcing engagements fail. And when they fail, you shut it down and then you go look for another outsourcer and they repeat the cycle. And so the companies that get stuck in this valley of death, kind of death spiral, will get through one outsourcer. They don't get to that point of long-term value and they come back and they start with the next one and it just repeats itself. So what we want to do by addressing these challenges is we want to make that valley of death as short and shallow as possible. And that takes communication and training and working together to work through those issues. But when you get to the other side of that, what we see is that that's when you start to have a team that starts to contribute real value to your project and you really start to see the returns on your investment in that relationship, in that engagement. We're going to transition here in a minute to talking to our 2 guests. But before I do that, at the end of this, we will send out some additional resources to help you if you want to dig a little deeper. These are resources that we found helpful as we've worked with outsourcing and worked with cross-cultural communication. While we're transitioning to the guests, there's another poll on the screen. If you can take a minute, just answer that. And I'm going to ask Paul and Kevin to join us.
Hello, Kevin and team. How are you?
So, hey, Paul, and hey, Kevin. So we're gonna let the poll run for a couple of more seconds here while we just introduce you guys. But Paul, Kevin, you want to just take 30 seconds, minute each, and introduce yourselves? Maybe we'll start with Kevin.
Yeah. So my name is Kevin Greer. I'm the Senior Director of Information Systems here at Tyndale House Publishers. I've been with the company for about 24 years, and we've been outsourcing our development for almost 3 years now.
All right. Paul?
My name is Paul Warrett. I work for Alliance Franchise Brands as their Vice President of Technology Support. I've been there for 15 years, and we've used outsourcing in many ways for quite some time, but the pace really picked up around 2015. And we've done several significant projects along with some general maintenance relationships we have. So thank you.
All right, thanks, guys. So before we dive into our first question, just looking at some of the poll results coming back, it looks like a lot of folks are saying that the biggest issue that they're facing is that communication issue. There's a few people have responded with productivity, quality, time zones, but communication is by far the number one there. And then it looks like number two, the number 2 one is quality. A few people said productivity, communication. So as you guys think about your experiences, what would you say of the 5 challenges that you've experienced? Which ones have you experienced and how did you go about overcoming them with your team? Paul, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Well, of the 5, I would say all of them is, of course, the answer. The time zone one is the least issue, I would say, with high bandwidth internet connections and time zones. Things can be planned out and scheduled. However, based on the poll results you just mentioned, as I was prepping some of the notes, I think that quality, communication, and productivity were mentioned as the top issues, and they're all interrelated. And a successful project can fail if any one of those goes down. And if one goes down, they're all going to go down. And if I say, regular status meetings are key. And if there's anything we've learned over our successive big projects, it's that having illustrated and detailed requirements is key. And, we've done it both ways. We've had long form written documents and things like that. But recently, we have really latched on to the idea that if you can draw a picture or a process map or do a quick video recording to share with your developer partner, that can really help move things along, particularly in the early stages of a project.
All right, thanks, Paul. How about you, Kevin? What's your experience been?
Well, for us, I would say communication is definitely up there. Primarily early on, it was difficult for a lot of the reasons that you had mentioned. And as we got to know each other better, the teams, the communication just became easier. The other technical challenge we had was bad internet connections. That was probably the hardest one to solve, simply because you can't control that. But there were times when we would just rely on emails and not rely on the video.
Okay, great, thank you. Kevin, why don't you, we'll have you jump into the second question and just keep going there. At what point in your outsourcing engagements did you feel that you were getting the value that you originally had planned for or were looking for? And what would you say was the biggest contributor to reaching that point?
I would say 6 months in, when we renewed our contract, is when I was starting to feel good about the progress, and I could see where we were headed. I knew that we were in that valley that you described, that we had some challenges there, but I could see the progress. And then about a year after we started our contract, I got the opportunity to go over to India to visit the team, to be there with feet on the ground, and to get to know them personally. And I would say that's the number one biggest contributor to kind of breaking through that barrier and really getting that value out of the outsourcing, because it really became an extension of my team rather than resources that were overseas.
Sure. Paul, how about for you?
Sure, a couple of things. I would say that your Valley of Death chart is true, and even though we've worked on several projects together, it happens every time. And I would say in each engagement, as you start climbing out of that Valley of Death together, that's when the partnership value is truly realized. And on our team, we've had a couple of moments that we call tears of joy, because there's the meetings were getting long, we're getting frustrated. So usually we know we are onto something when we see our first working user experience, where you can actually enter values, see calculations, and things like that. And then I would also complement that. You have a good client developer relationship, outsourced relationship, when you create an environment and a partnership that allows the outsourced developer partner to dig into the requirements to the point where they start to learn your company. And I'm not just talking about the needs of that project, but the broader context on why this project is needed. And on several occasions, the light bulb went on. We were working towards something that had been planned for months, and the outsourced partner made some suggestions based on everything we understand. We understand the end goal is here. Have you ever considered an alternate process such as A or B? That has happened on a couple of occasions. It encouraged some great conversation. And in each case I can think of, we went that route. So ultimately, it really is about a partnership and really good requirements, and being open to some flexibility on approach, because no project ever finishes the way it was mapped out in the beginning, at least in our experience.
All right. Thanks, Paul. Paul, maybe we'll ask you this next question first, but what advice would you give to someone who's just starting to outsource or is currently struggling with some aspect of their outsourcing arrangement? What would your advice to them be?
Not a problem. I would say, first of all, remember that while it is a strategic business arrangement, it also works best when it's a partnership. And the 5 challenges that you've illustrated so far, those don't apply and are not just the burden for the outsourced partner team. Those same challenges exist and can be problems on the client side as well. So I think the more that you understand that there's a project management and a stakeholder burden as the client, the better things will be. And when you're reaching out to a partner, the only other thing I would say, just as a minor item, is when it comes to attrition, turnover, skill sets, and things like that. If you can work with an outsourced partner team that approaches things from an FTE model, where you're going to engage with them and purchase so many full-time equivalents, and the developer team will bring skill sets on and off board as needed, there are huge advantages to that, and it really lightens the burden on the client to maintain that set of skill sets. We stay focused on our requirements, our needs, and I think if I could throw one more thing in, the heavy emphasis on QA is certainly needed. A partner that does deep QA before it's handed over to the client is great, but understand that anytime we've hit the valley of death, it's because all of the QA has been done by the developer. It's now on us to do it, and we don't have enough bandwidth to complete things in time to meet the agile process timeline. So, on all of the big projects to date, when we've gotten stuck, it's because we've created a backlog on our side from a QA perspective, and that all goes back to the items we're talking about: communication and quality, et cetera.
Okay, great. Thanks, Paul. Kevin, what would your advice be?
I think I would echo a lot of what Paul is saying, because I would take the approach that outsourcing is really an extension of your employees. And if you view them as simply a resource, that's really the tone that you're setting for the relationship. I have loved working with my teams at Covalience, and after spending time over there and spending time to get to know them, I'd say that's critical. You talked a little bit about relationship versus transaction, and I've experienced both of that. When we did an ERP upgrade, we did a lot of outsourcing in that work, and it was very transactional. You had to document everything. It was really, you send them the paper, you get back a response. And with my outsourcing team with Covalience, I can send them the description of what we're trying to accomplish. They will dig deeper into the requirements. They'll ask the questions that I may not even be thinking of, and kind of bring out a more refined scope of what is needed. And giving them the ability to run with it is huge.
All right, great. Thanks, Kevin. So those are the questions I had for you guys. We want to open it up and see if there's any questions from the audience today. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screens, and if you've got a question, please feel free to submit it there, and our team will field those questions and give them back to the Kevin and Paul and myself. So please feel free to enter any questions you might have. And Tracy, I'll hand it over to you to see what questions we have.
Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate that. Yes, so our first audience question, this one is for Kevin Greer. You had mentioned that one of the biggest challenges you guys faced when starting with outsourcing was communication. So what specific strategies have you found to be most helpful to effectively communicate and collaborate with your outsourced team?
I would say personal relationship, building that strong relationship has been the biggest factor there. It helps even when you're talking about technical scope, in just how you describe things, having some of that cultural background, having some of that history together, even helps in describing the technical needs.
Okay, yeah, that's great. Excellent. And another question, here's one for you, Paul. How did you go about selecting and evaluating your current outsourcing partner? What were the most important things that you looked for in an outsourcing partner?
Sure. Our initial contact with Covalience was by referral. So we had a bit of a leg up, but I assure you there was an extensive vetting process on our side, and everything centered around what we believed was the overly complex nature of the first big project we were going to throw at them. And I think, the key was establishing that teamwork, that relationship, and that begins even at, before you have any agreement to do anything. It's giving them, a set of requirements and talking it through. And where I think it really clicks is when you start to get the response and the questions. And in my experience, if you send a set of requirements by and all you get back is an hour's estimate, that would be a level of concern, because, I think where you really understand if there's some value there is when you get some deep questions. Like, I've read through this, what about this? How is this related to that? And, when you establish a relationship that is multi-project, you get added value in that, hey, this is our third project. We're working on this. It's somewhat related to the first. Are you planning to use the databases for any mutual reporting? That sort of thing.
Excellent. That's great. Kevin, any thoughts on that question? Kevin Greer?
Yeah, I think that particular question, let me go back to it, was...
Sorry, I can repeat it. How do you go about selecting or evaluating an outsourcing partner, and what were the most important things that you looked for?
For us personally, it came from high recommendations. And we looked for, when we were at first thinking about outsourcing, we were definitely nervous about it. And are we going to get what we need out of this? And so we talked to someone that we trusted, who had been outsourcing. We heard about their experience. And when we went to select an outsourced partner, we would ask those who had been with them to find out, okay, what are the struggles they've had? What are the successes? And really go off of recommendations.
Excellent. That's great. Yes, so another question from the audience. Paul, we can give this one to you first. Given that an effective project saves only 30 to 50%, but is higher risk, is it really worth it?
Absolutely. When unless that project is on an island on its own, you have to think to yourself that it's not about the project as stated. There are going to be supplemental phases and things that the stakeholders are going to bring back to you. So, I definitely think it's worth it. But what I would add is understand that those savings are complemented by the teamwork and effort that the client side has to bring, and that should be something that is also somewhat analyzed as well. And again, I really think that if you're looking for one-off projects where it's going to be a one and done, that's perhaps a different set of analysis. I think ultimately, just like Kevin and I have both mentioned referrals and recommendations as a key part of how we've achieved success. When we figure out how we can work better with certain companies for whatever reason, the project nature, the teamwork, et cetera, there's much more comfort level to continue that. And I would say that there are economies of scale. Every time we do a new phase or a new project, because of the history there, you get ramped up and get to the difficult questions that much quicker.
Excellent, thank you. That's very helpful. And another question, maybe Kevin Greer, you can answer this one. What was the biggest mistake you made in outsourcing, and how did you resolve it?
Biggest mistakes. I've made my fair share of them. Let me think about this one. I would say probably the biggest mistake is entering into it with the assumption that the outsourced team knows more about the process that I'm trying to accomplish than they really do. Realizing that I need to bring them up to speed with even the basics as to what does our company do and how is that affecting the project that we're working on right now. And the terminology that I'm so used to hearing day in and day out, they've never heard. So I would say approaching the project, just bringing assumptions as opposed to starting from scratch.
That's great. Any thoughts from you, Paul, for that one? What was the biggest mistake you made in outsourcing and how you resolved it?
We make this mistake more often than I like, but the mistake would have to do with believing that we're going to avoid the valley of death this time, and the requirements and the history are going to allow that to happen, and it just doesn't. And I think there's a strong desire to add in your requirements a timeline projection, and then go and make business decisions, assuming that that timeline will not change. And you really don't get a good idea of an accurate timeline for alpha testing, beta testing, and go live until you hit that first struggle and start to see the project come to form, meaning something that's live that you can actually do acceptance testing on.
Great. Sounds excellent. Perfect. Well, I think that's all the time we have for questions today. So thank you so much for everyone who's entered some questions. And if you have more questions that we weren't able to answer, we would be happy to talk with you further. Our CEO, Kevin Sandel, is passionate about helping technology leaders succeed in outsourcing. So he's created space in his schedule over the next few weeks to meet with anyone who would like to discuss their outsourcing challenges or to explore the possibility of outsourcing in the future. So we have put the link to his Calendly in the chat box below. Thank you to our CEO, Kevin Sandel, for sharing some key insights and strategies for maximizing outsourcing ROI. So thank you again for joining us today. We hope that you enjoyed our webinar, and we look forward to seeing you next time.